In the spring of 1775, one of the most powerful empires the world had ever known found its army completely trapped. And not by a rival nation or some professional military force, but by a sprawling, disorganized, and desperately under-equipped mob of its own subjects. This just wasn't supposed to happen. The British Army was the undisputed global superpower, a disciplined and fearsome force that had conquered vast territories across the globe. Their opponents? They were farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants. And yet, for 11 agonizing months, this ragtag militia held the British lion by the tail, bottling up thousands of the world's most elite troops inside the city of Boston. The real question is, how? How on earth did 15,000 rebels, with almost no artillery, a critical shortage of gunpowder, and no central command, manage to corner and ultimately evict the most powerful military on the planet? This wasn't just a single battle. It was a grueling 11-month standoff that seemed to defy all logic. It was the fiery, improbable start to the American Revolutionary War. The trouble had been brewing for years. Tensions in Boston over things like taxation without representation had simmered to a boiling point. On April 19th, 1775, that pot finally boiled over. The British general, Thomas Gage, dispatched troops from Boston to seize colonial military supplies hidden in the nearby town of Concord. The mission was meant to be a swift, secret operation to disarm the growing rebellion before it could even get started. It was anything but. Warned by writers like Paul Revere, local militias, the famous Minutemen, were ready and waiting. What started as clashes at Lexington and Concord quickly erupted into a full-blown running battle as the British retreated to Boston. All along that 18-mile march, militia from the surrounding towns swarmed the British column, firing from behind stone walls, trees, and houses. For the disciplined Redcoats, trained for open field warfare, it was an absolute nightmare. Harassed and bloodied, they staggered back into the safety of Boston, having suffered heavy casualties. The hornet's nest had been kicked, and as the sun went down, the victorious but chaotic colonial militias didn't just pack up and go home. They stayed. In the days that followed, something truly extraordinary happened. Militia units from as far away as New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut began arriving, and their numbers swelled to an estimated 15,000. They formed a massive arc of encampments that stretched from Cambridge to Roxbury, sealing off the only two land routes, Boston Neck and Charlestown Neck, that connected the city to the mainland. Inside Boston, General Gage and his garrison of nearly 11,000 professional soldiers were suddenly prisoners in their own fortress. They controlled the city, and the Royal Navy controlled the harbor, but they couldn't move an inch by land. The colonists had trapped a professional army, but they didn't really have an army of their own. This was just a spontaneous uprising. Recognizing the need for some kind of unified leadership, the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia took a monumental step. They officially adopted the New England Militia, creating the Continental Army and appointing a Virginian planter named George Washington as its commander-in-chief. His enormous task was to somehow forge these disparate, fiercely independent militias into a real fighting force that could take on an empire. Before Washington could even get there, the simmering siege exploded into the war's first major, bloody battle. On the night of June 16th, Colonial forces crept onto the hills of the Charlestown Peninsula, primarily Breed's Hill, which looked right down on Boston and its harbor. From this high ground, they could threaten the British ships. When the British woke up on June 17th, they were stunned to see a crude dirt fort had seemingly appeared overnight. General Gage, now joined by reinforcements and 3 other major generals, knew he couldn't let the rebels hold such a commanding position. But instead of just using the Navy to cut the rebels off, the newly arrived General William Howe chose a direct, frontal assault to show off the raw power of the British military. It was a catastrophic mistake. Twice, perfect lines of Redcoats marched bravely up the hill, and twice they were thrown back by a storm of musket fire, suffering horrifying losses. Famously, the colonial officers ordered their men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," a command born from the desperate need to conserve every last bit of gunpowder. On the third and final assault, the colonists ran out of ammunition and were forced to pull back. The British took the hill, but at a staggering cost. Over 1,000 of their soldiers were killed or wounded, a casualty rate of nearly 50% for the forces they sent in. The so-called Battle of Bunker Hill was technically a British victory, but it was a massive psychological victory for the Americans. They had proven that a rabble in arms could stand toe-to-toe with the finest soldiers in Europe and inflict devastating damage. After Bunker Hill, the British never again tried such a reckless, direct assault on a fortified American position. The bloody lesson had been learned. When George Washington finally arrived in Cambridge in July 1775, he didn't find a disciplined army. He found what he called a mixed multitude of people. His first and most daunting challenge was to instill order, build up fortifications, and somehow keep this volunteer force from simply going home as the long, cold winter approached. Most enlistments were set to expire at the end of the year, meaning his army was in constant danger of just melting away. Life for the American soldiers was hard. They lacked everything from uniforms to decent food. But as bad as it was for them, life inside Boston was even worse. The siege had completely cut off all food and firewood from the countryside. Supplies became dangerously scarce. Disease, especially smallpox, ran rampant through the cramped city, hitting civilians and soldiers alike. Diaries from the time paint a picture of a city gripped by anxiety and despair, where the constant sound of cannon fire was a reminder of how fragile life had become. The once bustling port was now a prison of hunger and fear. Washington knew that to break this stalemate, he needed one thing his army didn't have: heavy cannons. But hundreds of miles away, at the recently captured Fort Ticonderoga in New York, sat a treasure trove of British artillery, just waiting to be taken. In November 1775, Washington gave a seemingly impossible task to a 25-year-old Boston bookseller with a gift for military engineering named Henry Knox. Knox's mission: go to Ticonderoga and haul those cannons all the way back to Boston. What happened next was one of the most incredible logistical feats of the entire war. Through the dead of a brutal New England winter, Knox and his men moved 60 tons of iron and bronze, cannons, howitzers, and mortars across 300 miles of frozen rivers, snow-covered mountains, and rugged wilderness. Using 42 specially built sleds pulled by 80 yoke of oxen, they dragged the immense weight over the treacherous Berkshire Mountains. Cannons sometimes broke through the ice on frozen rivers, but each time they were painstakingly retrieved. In a letter to Washington, Knox simply wrote, "It is not easy to conceive the difficulties we have had." But he kept going. In late January 1776, after nearly 3 months of Herculean effort, the noble train of artillery arrived at the American camp. Washington finally had the key to victory. Washington had the weapon he needed, and he knew exactly where to use it. Dorchester Heights, a set of hills south of Boston, offered a perfect, commanding view of both the city and the harbor where the British fleet was anchored. For months, this key position had been left unoccupied by either side. Washington planned to repeat the Bunker Hill strategy, only this time with overwhelming firepower to back it up. On the night of March 4th, 1776, under the cover of darkness and a diversionary bombardment from other positions, thousands of American soldiers swarmed Dorchester Heights. They worked frantically through the night, hauling the massive Ticonderoga cannons up the steep frozen slopes and digging them into new fortifications. When the sun rose on March 5th, a stunned General Howe looked through his telescope and saw a formidable new fortress bristling with cannon pointing directly at his army and his ships. He's said to have exclaimed, "These fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." His position was now completely hopeless. The American guns could destroy his fleet at will, and trying to storm the heights would be a repeat of the slaughter at Bunker Hill. But even worse, Washington had achieved checkmate. Howe briefly thought about ordering an attack, but a convenient storm rolled in, giving him the perfect excuse to scrap the plan. He was outmaneuvered, and he knew it. He had no choice but to withdraw. He made an informal deal with Washington. If the American guns stayed silent, he would evacuate Boston without burning it to the ground. On March 17th, 1776, a day still celebrated in Boston as Evacuation Day, the British made good on that promise. Over 120 ships carried 11,000 British troops and nearly 1,000 Loyalist civilians away from Boston, sailing for Halifax, Nova Scotia. After 11 long months, the siege was over. Boston was free, and it would remain in American hands for the rest of the war. The siege of Boston was so much more than the first major military campaign of the Revolution. It was the crucible that forged a scattered collection of militias into the Continental Army. It proved that American soldiers, when they were well led and fighting for a cause they truly believed in, could outlast and outsmart the greatest military power on earth. It cemented George Washington's leadership and gave the brand new nation a massive surge of confidence that it would desperately need in the long, dark years of war that were still to come. It was a victory won not just by soldiers, but by the ingenuity of a bookseller, the resilience of a people, and the audacious belief that a mob of rebels could, in fact, trap an empire. If you found this story of revolutionary ingenuity fascinating, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more deep dives into the pivotal moments that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments which other Revolutionary War battles you'd like to see covered next. Thanks for watching.